Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, a pretty big topic, the ASEAN Economic Community, or the AEC.
Exactly. And we've gathered quite a bit of material here that should give you the full story. The history, what they're aiming for, where things stand now, and importantly, what the future might look like for this really significant economic integration effort in Southeast Asia.
Right. And for you, our listener, we know you want to understand what's what, but maybe without getting completely bogged down in detail. So we've tried to do the heavy lifting here.
Yeah, the aim is really to pull out those key insights, the things you really need to know about the AEC.
Our mission, then?
Pretty simple, really. Extract the essentials from the history, the different blueprints, clarify its purpose, its ambitions, how far it's actually come.
So by the end of this, you'll have a solid perspective.
That's the plan.
Okay, so let's get into it. The foundations, they go way back, right? To when ASEAN itself was formed in '67?
That's right. ASEAN kicked off with just 5 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand.
Okay.
And their initial goals were pretty broad, but, crucial. Things like economic cooperation, regional stability, building friendships, essentially.
And then it grew.
Yeah, eventually expanded to the 10 member states we know today.
And moving forward from '67, there were some key milestones on the path to this economic community idea. I'm thinking of things like AFTA.
Definitely. AFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Area, established back in 1992, that was a really big early step, reducing trade barriers.
Right.
And then later, the ASEAN Charter in 2008, that gave ASEAN a stronger legal and institutional backbone.
Which presumably allowed for more ambitious stuff.
Exactly. It sort of paved the way for bigger economic projects.
Which brings us, I suppose, to 2007 and the signing of the AEC blueprint. That feels like a real shift. What was the main idea there?
It really was pivotal. The ambition in 2007 was, nothing short of creating a single market and a single production base across all of Asia.
A single market.
Yeah. And the target date was 2015. The main goal driving that was to seriously accelerate economic growth and make the whole region, more competitive globally.
So a single market, what did that actually involve? What were the building blocks?
Well, the blueprint laid out several key areas. First, obviously, eliminating tariffs, building on what AFTA had started,
Right.
but also things like setting up a regional production network, making logistics much smoother, harmonizing standards, and professional qualifications.
The qualifications bit is interesting.
Yeah, and attracting better quality investment, integrating capital markets banking too, and even trying to address skill shortages across the region.
That is quite a comprehensive list, all aimed for 2015 initially.
That was the initial target date, yes.
Yeah.
But, it's not like they just stopped there. Integration is a process.
Right, it doesn't just happen overnight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So recognizing that, in 2013, they signed a new AEC blueprint. This was part of the bigger Asian Community Vision 2025.
Okay, so extending the timeline and maybe deepening the goals.
Precisely. Deepening and broadening the integration that had already started.
So if we step back a bit, the fundamental why behind all this, it seems like it's always been about more than just pure economics.
Oh, absolutely. The founding principle of ASEAN itself was this idea that regional integration, working together, would lead to lasting peace and shared prosperity.
Makes sense.
And the AEC is really the main economic pillar of that vision. It's designed specifically to make sure the benefits of economic collaboration reach all the member countries.
And I recall the Bali Concord SECA around the early 2000s really hammered home that commitment.
You're right. Bali Concord II was where leaders made a very clear statement about deepening economic integration within ASEAN and also strengthening ties with the global economy. That was really setting the stage for the AEC concept.
And the hopes were pretty high, weren't they? Thinking about things like more competition leading to better services, a better climate for investment.
Yes.
And maybe closing some of those development gaps between the member countries.
Those were definitely key aspirations. The ultimate vision was transforming ASEAN into this single market, free flow of goods, services, investment, capital.
The 4 freedoms, almost like the EU model in a way.
Sort of, yes, those key flows. The end goal being a stable, prosperous, and crucially, a highly competitive ASEAN economic region.
So practically speaking, this must have meant big changes for ASEAN's own institutions and for professionals working across the region.
Huge implications. I mean, just think about implementing these agreements, ensuring compliance across 10 different countries, coordinating national policy.
Yeah, that coordination piece sounds tricky.
It is. And the scope of cooperation had to expand, too. Things like human resource development, recognizing professional qualifications, which we mentioned,
Right.
consulting on macro policy, finance, improving infrastructure and connectivity, and importantly, getting the private sector more involved.
And the vision for this AEC region had some key characteristics they were aiming for.
Yes, four main ones usually highlighted: a single market and production base, a highly competitive economic region, equitable economic development.
Equitable, that's important given gaps.
Very. And finally, being fully integrated into the global economy.
Now, we mentioned AFTA earlier. It sounds like that was really the groundwork, the essential first step for the AEC.
AFTA was absolutely foundational. Established 92, remember. Its goals were clear: speed up trade within the region, boost growth and competitiveness, attract foreign investment,
FDI, yeah.
and generally strengthen ASEAN's standing in the global industries.
So freer trade relations, more investment flows.
Exactly. And also offering some protection against unfair competition from outside the region.
And the mechanism they used for cutting tariffs was the CEPT scheme.
That's the one, the Common Effective Preferential Tariff Scheme, signed in 92 alongside AFTA. It was the framework for how countries would actually reduce tariffs on goods traded between them.
Okay.
And importantly, AFTA's scope wasn't static. It was expanded further in 2006.
So how did AFTA directly lead into the AEC structure? Was it like a building block?
Very much so. The ASEAN Trade and Goods Agreement, or TIG, which is a core part of the AEC framework, essentially built right on top of AFTA.
I see.
Member countries used the agreements they already had under AFTA, the tariff schedules, the planned reductions, the exemptions, as the starting point for the AEC's goods liberalization.
So AFTA really opened the door for market access within ASEAN, and that CEPT scheme helped make things more transparent.
Precisely. It smoothed the path for trade liberalization and brought in important elements of transparency and predictability. You knew what the rules were, generally.
And then comes that really key moment in 2007, the Cebu Declaration. What was so significant about that one?
Yeah, April 2007. That's when the ASEAN leaders formally agreed, right there in Cebu, to establish the AEC by 2015.
Okay, setting the date officially.
And positioning it clearly as one of the three main pillars of the whole ASEAN Community project, the other two being political security and sociocultural.
Right, part of a bigger vision.
Exactly. The AEC was a central piece of the Asian Vision 2020, this idea of a concert of nations, a developed region.
And to make that happen, they needed a plan.
They needed the roadmap.
Mm.
And that's where the detailed AEC blueprint came in. It was the action plan.
And this blueprint, it was formally adopted later that year.
Yes, approved in Singapore in November 2007. It was part of the wider roadmap for an Asian community. And the blueprint itself laid out the overview, the goals, the key characteristics we mentioned, and importantly, how they intended to build it.
So the core aim was this level playing field idea: businesses operating across ASEAN as easily as in their home country, consolidating strengths.
That was the hope, yes, consolidating national economic strengths into a stronger regional bloc. But it became clear pretty quickly that just cutting tariffs wasn't going to be enough.
Right. You need more than just cheaper goods crossing borders.
Exactly. That deep integration requires much more policy coordination. Harmonizing regulations, getting standards to converge, that's where the really heavy lifting is.
And that's why, even though the AEC was officially launched in 2015, it was always seen as more of a process.
Absolutely. An incremental process.
Yeah.
With ongoing monitoring, scorecards to track progress across different areas. It wasn't a flick of a switch in 2015.
And those 5 pillars we touched on: single market, competitive region, equitable development, global integration, they still frame the ambition. But achieving them must have hit some roadblocks. What were the big challenges?
Oh, definitely challenges. A major one, as you hinted at earlier, is the uneven economic development among the members.
Yeah.
You've got Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam. Their economies are just structured differently, have different capacities compared to, say, Malaysia or Singapore.
And how does that hinder integration?
Well, it can make some of the less developed countries hesitant to fully open up. They might worry about their domestic industries being overwhelmed.
Understandable.
And this difference in capacity, this development gap, it can actually worsen instability or inequality if the AEC commitments aren't managed carefully or if they aren't met across the board. It puts a drag on the whole process.
And another challenge seems baked into ASEAN's structure itself: the lack of strong central enforcement, unlike, say, the EU.
That's a critical point. ASEAN works largely on consensus and national willingness.
The Asian way.
Right. Which means when a country's national interests don't quite align with a regional commitment, you can get delays. Or sometimes things just don't get fully implemented. There's no central body forcing compliance.
And one challenge mentioned in our sources that might surprise some people is the issue of low-skilled labor. It wasn't really included in the free movement agenda in the same way as skilled labor. Why was that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Several reasons seem to be at play. First, just the practical difficulty. Managing the free movement of low-skilled workers across 10 countries with different labor laws, social systems, it's incredibly complex.
Much more so than professionals, perhaps.
Arguably, yes. Second, there were real fears in many member states about, a sudden influx of low-skill labor potentially disrupting their own domestic job markets, maybe pushing down wages, causing social friction.
Political sensitivity there.
Very much so. And thirdly, and this is quite counterintuitive, some governments seem to perceive the free movement of low-skilled workers as less of a threat to, say, national identity or security compared to highly skilled professionals moving around.
Interesting distinction.
It is, especially when you think about the potential economic benefits if labor could move more freely to where it's actually needed most. But it was largely left off the main agenda.
Okay. So despite these hurdles, ASEAN has grown into a really significant regional organization, right? It talks to major global powers.
Absolutely. Its evolution over the decades is pretty remarkable. And the AEC has delivered on guaranteeing freer movement for key things: goods, services, investment capital, and importantly, skilled labor, even with the challenges we just discussed.
We've seen practical things like easier travel within ASEAN for tourism and things like that.
Yes, definitely progress there. Simplifying visa rules, making travel generally easier, that directly helps tourism, fosters cultural exchange, builds that sense of an ASEAN community.
And it's not just economic cooperation, is it? It covers a whole range.
That's right. Cooperation happens on social, political, environmental fronts, tourism, culture. It's broad.
But focusing back on the economics, tariff reduction has been a major success story, relatively speaking.
Yes, getting tariffs down towards that 0 to 5% range for most goods traded within ASEAN, that's been significant progress. The AC blueprint provides that vision of a stable, prosperous, competitive region.
And you also have these smaller sub-regional initiatives like BIMP-EAGA. How do they fit into the bigger AEC picture?
Right, the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East Asian Growth Area. Initiatives like that help deepen the overall integration by focusing on specific links within smaller, connected geographical zones.
Like mini ASEANs within ASEAN.
In a way, yeah. They can sometimes move faster on specific local issues or opportunities, complementing the broader AEC goals.
Now, our sources talk about the impacts, positive and negative, on individual countries. It sounds like AEC isn't automatically a win-win for everyone all the time.
That's a very fair assessment. It's complex. On the plus side, you'd expect more efficient resource allocation countries specializing more. Consumers should benefit from lower prices, more choice.
Okay.
And hopefully more investment flows into the less developed members, boosting their growth.
But the potential downsides?
Where you could see increased inequality, both within countries and between them. Some industries might really struggle with the increased competition, leading to job losses, adjustment costs.
To distributional issues.
Exactly. The benefits might not spread evenly. There are always winners and losers in these kinds of transitions, at least in the short term.
It's interesting. One source points out a difference between AEC and the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
Yeah.
It says the AEC doesn't quite have the same concept of member states in its agreements. What does that actually mean?
That's a subtle but important point. In the WTO, agreements are fundamentally between individual nation-states. The AEC operates more as a collective regional bloc when it makes commitments.
Ah, so the obligations are more group-based.
In a sense, yes. The level of integration aimed for is deeper, and the way liberalization happens is framed more regionally than just nation to nation within the bloc. It changes the dynamic.
And a huge focus for the AEC, beyond tariffs, has been tackling non-tariff barriers, right? Those tricky regulations and procedures.
Absolutely crucial. Because even with zero tariffs, if customs procedures are slow or product standards don't align, trade doesn't flow smoothly.
So what are they doing about that?
Things like harmonizing customs processes. The ASEAN single window is a big initiative there, addressing different food safety or agricultural standards, working on mutual recognition agreement for product testing and certification.
So my product tested in one ASEAN country is accepted in another.
That's the goal. It's about reducing that red tape, making trade faster and more predictable for businesses. Still a work in progress, though.
Looking ahead now, it seems the AEC is getting noticed globally. One source even suggests it's maybe watched more closely than the EU in some ways now. Why might that be?
It's a strong claim, but it probably reflects the sheer economic dynamism of Southeast Asia. It's a region that's growing fast, strategically vital.
And trade within ASEAN is growing.
Yes, inter-regional trade has definitely increased, showing that economic integration is having a real effect. Plus, the AEC framework is seen as important for coordinating and financing big infrastructure projects the region needs.
And could a stronger AEC help ASEAN navigate tricky geopolitics, regional rivalries, and so on?
That's certainly one of the hopes. Deeper economic interdependence might give ASEAN more collective weight, more resilience in managing external pressures, and navigating those complex relationships in the wider region.
The focus seems to be on boosting internal coordination while managing those outside influences carefully.
That sums it up well, yeah.
And the future seems increasingly digital, doesn't it? There's talk of an ASEAN Digital Economic Community, a DEC. What's the thinking there?
Yes, the DEC is a really big potential next step. The idea is to harness the huge digital growth happening across ASEAN.
Like e-commerce, fintech.
Exactly. And maybe use digital integration to boost overall economic growth, which is slowed a bit compared to some other regions. A truly seamless pan-Asian digital market that could be transformative. Huge potential.
But it's surprising, given all this activity, that public awareness about the AEC seems quite low. One source used an iceberg metaphor, lots hidden below the surface.
It is surprising, isn't it? It probably comes down to a few things. The details are often technical, quite complex, not easy for the average person to follow.
Maybe the benefits feel a bit distant sometimes.
That too. The benefits of regional integration can be diffuse, not always immediately obvious in daily life like, say, a national tax cut might be. Plus, maybe communication about the AEC could be better.
And how does the AEC stack up against other regional blocs, like in the Americas or the Middle East?
Well, comparisons are tricky, but the analysis we saw suggests ASEAN, through the AEC, has actually done quite well in terms of how comprehensive its agreements are and the progress on tariff reductions compared to some others like AFTA or SAFTA or the GCC.
So punching above its weight, perhaps?
Or at least holding its own. It shows a real commitment, on paper at least, from the member states.
And facing global economic headwinds, is ASEAN turning more inwards, focusing on strengthening the AEC for resilience?
It seems so. There's definitely a focus on improving that internal networking, cooperation on things like trade facilitation, making supply chains more robust within the region. It's seen as a way to buffer against global shocks.
But getting the private sector properly involved, that still seems like a challenge they're grappling with.
It really is. How do you effectively bring businesses, big and small, across all sectors into the policy process? How do you make sure these regional initiatives actually meet their practical needs?
Timing issues, integrating different business groups.
Yeah, all of that. It's complex finding the right mechanisms to make that partnership work smoothly. Still more art than science, maybe.
And labor mobility. We talked about low-skilled labor being left out, but even for skilled workers, it's not straightforward. The example of the marine engineer.
Right, that example really grounds it. You might have the AEC framework saying skilled labor can move, but then you hit practical hurdles.
Like qualifications not being recognized.
Exactly. Mutual recognition isn't fully there across all professions. Language barriers can be an issue. Different regulations in each country.
So still friction in the system.
Definitely. Lots of friction still needs smoothing out to get the real benefits of skilled labor mobility. And low-skill movement, as we said, is a whole different, largely unaddressed challenge.
Okay, and finally, attracting investment, FDI, crucial for growth. Our sources stress the economic openness and domestic reform.
Absolutely fundamental. Investors, whether domestic or foreign, need a stable, predictable, transparent environment. So ongoing reforms within each ASEAN country, maintaining that openness, that's key to keeping investment flowing and fueling the integration process.
So pulling this all together then, the ASEAN Economic Community, it's this incredibly ambitious, long-term project to create a deeply integrated single market, a production hub right here in Southeast Asia.
It really is. And it's a journey, not a destination. We've seen huge steps since ASEAN began. AFTA was key. The AEC blueprints provided the map. And the push continues with the Vision 2025.
But as we've really dug into, there are these persistent, tough challenges, those big differences in development levels between countries,
Are huge.
and just the inherent difficulty of getting 10 diverse nations, each with their own interests, to pull consistently in the same direction.
That's the core tension, isn't it? And looking forward, the AEC has to navigate the digital transformation, figure out its place in a complex global order, and keep chipping away at those non-tariff barriers.
Yeah.
And the low public awareness. That highlights a need maybe for better storytelling, connecting the AEC's goals to people's actual lives.
For me, some of the real aha moments listening to all this are just appreciating the layers. It looks like economic integration on the surface, but underneath you have all this political reality, the history,
Right.
the sheer scale of the coordination needed, and this long-term vision that stretches way beyond that original 2015 date. It's fascinatingly complex.
I agree completely, and it really makes you think, doesn't it? Given that constant balancing act between national interests and regional goals, what's the most critical thing needed for the AEC to keep moving forward, to keep evolving? Maybe that's the next deep dive, how those national interests really play out day to day within the AEC structures.
That is a really interesting thought. And for you, our listener, we really hope this exploration has given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of the ASEAN Economic Community, where it's come from, where it is now, and the significant path still ahead.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.